In this episode, we talk about the Indian economy and what failing on health matrix does to a country's growth. We also take a look at the fresh attachment orders in the Anil Ambani group probe. But we begin today by talking about a new set of UGC rules that were aiming to eradicate discrimination on Indian campuses and which have now been put on hold. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Just weeks after the UGC notified new anti-discrimination rules for colleges and universities, the Supreme Court yesterday put them on hold. The Promotion of Equity in Higher Education Institutions regulations of 2026 mandated anti-discrimination committees and formal complaint mechanisms across universities. But the pushback to these rules has been sharp. It has triggered protests, resignations, and a familiar charge that such rules will be misused. And yesterday, a bench led by Chief Justice Suryakant issued notice to the centre and the UGC while hearing a clutch of petitions challenging the rules. The bench said that the rules raise several important questions which, if not addressed, will have very sweeping consequences and will divide the society. So to understand what exactly was the UGC trying to change on campuses, we are joined by the Indian Express's Vidheesha Kuntamalla in this segment. Vidheesha, before we talk about these rules, let's talk about the problem of discrimination on campuses, specifically caste discrimination. Now, when we think of discrimination, we often assume direct abuse or harassment. But during your reportage, when you spoke with academics, they told you how such discrimination can operate in quieter and subtle ways. So, could you tell our listeners what were the most common ways caste bias showed up on campus?
So what came up repeatedly in conversations with academicians was that caste discrimination on campus is rarely loud. It's not always slurs or overt harassment. It shows up structurally. Students enter universities with very unequal schooling backgrounds. In most cases, upper caste students often come from private schooling and English medium schools, whereas many students from reserved categories come from government or state board schools. So over time, this gap gets misread as merit or intelligence, and struggling with English or academic articulation is seen as a personal failure, not a structural disadvantage. So caste operates very quietly through grading, in classroom participation, supervision, access to opportunities. So many of these people that we spoke to also mentioned how common instances like asking for someone's All India rank in their first year in an institute, in a classroom is nowadays. That is also in a way indicative of which background you come from, right? So all of this has come to the forefront in our conversations with scholars.
Right, and when we speak of caste discrimination in higher education, there are cases like those involving Rohit Vemula and Payal Tadvi that still continue to shape regulatory thinking, even a decade later. So could you remind our listeners about them?
So these two cases continue to shape everything we're seeing today. So Rohit Vemula was a PhD scholar at Hyderabad Central University who died by suicide in 2016 after institutional actions including suspension and isolation, followed by his political activism on campus. His letters revealed how exclusion can be administrative and bureaucratic and not just personal. So, of course, Rohit Vemula's wave was also quite huge. It had ripple effects in other states as well, which created a student movement. And on the other hand, Payal Tadvi was a young Adivasi medical student who died by suicide in 2019 after allegedly facing sustained caste-based harassment by senior colleagues. In both cases, committees existed on paper, but they have somehow failed to intervene meaningfully. So that institutional failure is what pushed these regulations into existence when both the scholars' mothers had approached the judiciary.
And so, Vidheesha, speaking of these new UGC anti-discrimination rules, can you tell us what they mandate universities to do differently from before?
So the biggest change is enforcement this time. Of course, these are amendments to the rules which came out in 2012, but the amendments created a lot of noise this time because they were quite big this time. So earlier equity rule regulations were an advisory, okay? So universities could ignore them with very little consequence. But under the 2026 rules, every institution must set up equal opportunity centers, equity committees, equity squads, and 24-hour helplines. Complaints have to be formally recorded and processed. Most importantly, the UGC can now penalize institutions by withholding grants or denying permissions to run programs if they don't comply. So that enforcement power is new this time.
And also, do we know how they define discrimination?
So earlier in 2012, when the rules had come out, the regulations defined caste-based discrimination as discrimination based only on caste or tribe against scheduled castes, scheduled tribes. Earlier, OBCs were not clearly included in the draft version. After criticism, this time they have also included the OBCs. But this time, the grounds of discrimination are not clear. So there needs to be more clarification on what constitutes as discrimination on ground. I mean, when we're talking about discrimination on campus, it's a huge ambit. So these regulations don't really give a clear ground as to what they mean by caste discrimination. Is it verbal? Is it physical? So that clarity is yet to be attained, and that should be clarified by the ministry.
Right, and Vidisha, as you mentioned, that these regulations focus on grievance redressal. And many universities already have committees, right, for ragging, grievances, and harassment. But quite often they are criticized for being ineffective. So why is that? And also, how are these rules supposed to change that?
So the approach is very procedural. Once a complaint is made, the equity committee must meet within 24 hours. A report has to be submitted within 15 days, and the head of the institution must initiate action within 7 days. So there are also mobile equity squads, equity ambassadors, and helplines, all meant to make discrimination visible and reportable. So the regulations treat discrimination as something that can be identified, documented, and acted upon within a fixed timeline. So the core problem isn't the absence of committees, it's the institutional culture. Universities already have anti-ragging cells, grievance committees, sexual harassment committees. Many function symbolically without, urgency or independence. Academics pointed out that if scholarships are delayed, complaints are dismissed, or administrators are defensive, then committees don't help. The new regulations attempt to fix this through UGC monitoring and penalties, but whether that translates into real institutional sensitivity is still uncertain.
And one of the most contested parts of the regulation is that the rules place caste, EWS, and disability under a single equity framework. So why is this grouping at the center of the debate? And also, how have critics responded to these?
So because caste operates very differently from economic disadvantage or disability, critics argued that caste is permanent. It shapes social perception, right, across a lifetime. And poverty can change. Disability has a different legal and social framework. So this was one argument given to us by one section of academicians. But there's also another set of academicians and scholars who say that by placing them together, some scholars feel caste is being diluted into a generic category of disadvantage. Others defend it as legally pragmatic, arguing that any discrimination law must cast a wide net. So the debate isn't about inclusion, it's about whether caste is being flattened.
And Vidisha, a lot of the backlash has focused on fears of misuse or selective application. So what's driving this concern regarding misuse?
So there are two layers to the misuse fear. One is administrative concerns about, ambiguous terms like implicit discrimination and the removal of penalties for false complaints. Student groups like AVP have openly expressed this unease. Second layer is sociological. Every law meant to protect marginalized groups is first met with misuse fears. Reservations, the Atrocities Act, now these regulations. So the educationists, sociologists we've spoken to argue this often reflects discomfort with accountability. Behavior that was once normalized is now being questioned, and that creates a resistance. That is another side of the argument. But most of the unease, of course, we have already read about what is happening in Lucknow. a few BJP leaders have resigned in protest of these regulations. The ABVP has also openly spoken about, how earlier there was a way to penalize people who misused these particular regulations by filing false complaints. Now that that facility has been done away with, student groups, including the ABVP, have expressed a lot of unease, stating that this could create a divide between the general category students and the reserve category students on ground, where, they might not be comfortable speaking to each other on campus grounds.
And lastly, Vidheesha, we know that the Supreme Court has now put a hold on these rules. So what would be your watch points in this regard?
So the centre has been careful. I mean, the Union Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan has publicly said that discrimination will not be allowed against anyone and that misuse will not be tolerated either. He said this after the rules had come out and the backlash had started. There were protests on ground, and then this was what publicly he had to come out and say. He also emphasized that the regulations are constitutional and were framed under the supervision of the Supreme Court, where the matter is still pending. So politically, the government is trying to signal balance, but also not appearing dismissive of concerns. The ABVP, as far as we have learned, has also written to the UGC. There was also a protest in Delhi by several students in front of the UGC on Tuesday, where this group of students, we've also learned that they've written a few demands to the UGC and submitted them. So we have to wait and watch for a few clarifications regarding the ambiguity of these regulations.
And next, we shift our focus to the state of the Indian economy. For months now, India has been worried about the long-term impact of the 50% tariffs the United States has imposed on most of Indian goods. The concern is that Indian exporters could permanently lose clients and relationships they've built over years, leading to thousands of job losses and a blow to the economy. That's also why India was keen to sign a trade deal with the EU and the UK. Now, last week at the World Economic Forum in Davos, economist and former IMF chief Gita Gopinath was part of a panel discussing India's economic future. And she was asked, what can India do to actually help businesses grow? And her answer wasn't what most people were expecting.
So, taking out more and more of the archaic rules that have held back businesses is absolutely critical. But then all other aspects of India will also have to continue in terms of the reforms will have to continue, the ones we talked about on land and labor. One of the areas I wanted to point out, which we usually don't talk about when you're talking about business development, is I want to talk about pollution. Mm-hmm. Pollution is a challenge in India. And if you look at the impact of pollution on the Indian economy, it is far more consequential than any impact of any tariffs that have been put on India so far. If you look at the annual cost to India's GDP of the level of pollution that you have, and it's not just the effect on economic activity, but it's also the loss in lives. I mean, the numbers are really large. Based on a World Bank study that was done, I think it was published in 22, about 1.7 million lives are lost every year in India because of pollution. That's 18% of the deaths in India. I think even from any international investor's perspective who's thinking of coming in and putting up a shop in India, if you have to live there and you have the environment is not of the kind that you feel that, okay, this is going to be consequential for your health, it holds you back. And obviously, not to say, but all the Indians that are living in this kind of pollution. So addressing that on a war footing is critical. I mean, this has to be a mission, a top mission for India.
Along with deregulation.
What stood out about her response was that it directly linked environmental and health factors to economic growth, something we don't really talk about very often. So in this segment, that's exactly what we'll be doing. Here's my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaking to the Indian Express's Udit Misra about this crucial connection.
Udit, we often think and talk about the economy and the health of a population as two separate things, as if they're not connected to each other. We don't often talk about the GDP being affected by how people are doing physically. So to what extent are these two things related? How much does the health of a citizen actually affect the nation's economy?
So yeah, it is a remarkably odd thing because, if you look at otherwise personal health, you see so much of social media dominated by how if you are physically better off, then your productivity will go up, right? So oddly enough, in the common notion, that doesn't seem to sort of aggregate to how it happens with the country. Like if the people are better off in terms of their physical and mental health, then how the country could actually produce more. And that should be fairly straightforward. Let me just take a step back and tell you about something called the Copenhagen Consensus. This is a think tank which did, from what I remember, thrice it sort of sat down with top economists, top scientists, and said that, okay, let's give you a problem. You have $75 billion. Choose one problem that you want to solve, right? We will, suppose do a thought experiment. And they did this experiment in 2004, 2008, and 2012, right? And every time the number one answer was that invest in children's health. Malnutrition amongst children, say under 5, stunting, wasting, that should be addressed, and that would give you the best economic returns. And then they drilled down to different countries and figured out, and I looked at the India data, and I'd written about this in one of the earlier explained speakings that I wrote, that $1 invested towards addressing malnutrition of children in India would lead to a return of something like $45 to $140, ranging between that. Now, typically this is through better incomes that those kids will then earn if they were not malnourished. This is just to explain, how, you could link between health issues and productivity of a nation. So it is generally not talked about, but it is very intrinsic. And that is the point that Gita Gopinath was making, that the tariffs have not done anything remotely as bad as what we have done to ourselves by letting pollution kill millions of Indians every year.
And basically, when we're talking about investing in children's health, and especially from an economic point of view, is the idea that if you do that, then they'll grow up to be more productive individuals. Their health problems won't come in the way of whatever they wish to do, and they'll be able to contribute to India's economy.
Yes, precisely. It's on both sides, on what your population can do, participate, and be part of a different economy. We know how AI is changing things, and increasingly people are talking about humans having to do more cerebral work to perhaps survive in this kind of a job market. So you need actually greater cognitive abilities, if anything, more healthy people to be really productive. AI can help increase your productivity, but, you also have to be more healthy yourself to be taking part of advantage of that. The other side, obviously, is who pays if you are predominantly ill society, unwell society. And that comes to the question of, governments having to pay that money for which they will tax, or else, it's coming out of your own pocket. So high expenditure in private healthcare, both of which we are seeing. I mean, health cost inflation is one of the highest amongst all the kinds of inflation that you would be facing. Anybody who's gone to a hospital would know this. So both ways, it sort of undermines the economic capacity of the country.
Right. Sometimes people's entire savings go away when they fall sick.
Yeah, many Indians, or even the so-called middle class, is just one illness away from sort of falling into the debt trap, or even, at real poverty levels. And in India, the main resource is human resources, and at a time when the rest of the world is actually struggling with human resources, most of the Western world is struggling with the declining population. China is likely to face a increasingly aging population in a decade or two. And India is the big hope that we have a young population. But what is the point of a young population if it is not healthy?
And it's interesting that you bring this point up, because there's a common misconception that, we are overpopulated and that's the real problem. People say that only if we had a smaller population, we'd be better off.
Yes, I mean, this is something that I've heard from many people, which who will say that in terms of GDP, we are the fourth largest economy. We have $4 trillion of GDP. It's just that we are 1.4 billion. So then you divide and you come to a low per capita income. But the right way to see it is that it took you 1.4 billion people to reach the 4 trillion number, right? When US is at 30 trillion at a much lower population level. Now, I'm not saying that this is a direct competition and I'm not making that kind of an argument, but what I'm saying is that per capita productivity matters, and you have to look at it honestly and say, how can we improve the per capita productivity? How can we make kids coming out of school more productive? How can we make those who are already in workforce more productive, right? There is no getting away from that. And population is a great resource if it is productive. If it is not, then what they say, the other side of demographic dividend is that it can turn into a demographic bomb.
And so considering how important health is, and experts have repeatedly picked this as the thing that they would prioritize above all else, tell us, to what extent has India invested in health over the years?
So we've had a rather checkered history, and that's to put it mildly. I think most people who track this issue will say that India is heavily underinvested in people. And this has become a problem which has increasing costs because, we are experiencing a once in a lifetime kind of a generational demographic boom. Everybody is sort of looking at us. Now, if we have not invested in our health, in our kids' education in the past, and we continue to underinvest in that, we will miss out whatever great benefits that could have come from this demographic dividend. It would not be a dividend. Now, if you look at it in terms of, say, budget is about to again be released for the next financial year, and every year we talk about different allocations. India's allocation to health is typically below 2% of the total budget. And that's worryingly low. I mean, most people would advocate something like 6%, right? The global average is, I think, slightly more than 6%. The advanced countries might be spending something like 8.5% of their budget on that. And we are talking still about percentages. Obviously, Indian budget is much smaller than, say, an advanced country. So you can understand how much underinvesting we are doing given the size of our population, right? Because that money is then divided into a much larger population in India as against, say, in the West. So our levels of investment in health are much lower. And actually, since 2009-10, around that time, we've also seen a distinct trend where the government has actually moved away from direct provisioning of healthcare. It has sort of tacitly or not so tacitly also openly accepted that we cannot provide healthcare for everybody. So we are pulling back. We'll provide you some kind of a health insurance, not direct health provisioning, and we will let you go to the private sector to seek treatment. But the private sector is obviously the costs are much higher. And that is a very damaging trend for a country like India where the average income levels are much lower. So it has not been a very optimistic picture on investments in health.
And it is both surprising and worrying that despite there being so much evidence for it, India still doesn't invest in healthcare as much. Can you cite some examples of countries that have done this, though? Countries that have invested significantly in healthcare and health infrastructure and that are now reaping its returns?
Yeah, I think, the very easy thing to do is to sort of look at Nordic countries, the Western European countries, and say that, look, they invested so much. But closer home, even China invested far more on health and education than India did. It's one of the old debates on whether you should invest first in your population's health and education, and then will you be able to grow, or should you first grow, God knows how, and then invest in the health and education. But yeah, I mean, if you look at China and India, the Human Development Index data, we are roughly like 20-25 years behind China. And it seems fairly straightforward to me that especially in a world where more and more cognitive abilities would be required, we need to invest first, front load those investments in health and education and taking care of things like pollution, which bring down productivity, before we can really hope that this population will actually be productive. It's a little difficult to imagine how India can have cities which are so polluted, right? And areas where we expect the world to invest to be so polluted and still continue to attract investments. This is again another thing that keeps coming up in the data in the last 1 year, that foreigners are not investing in India. In fact, one of the pieces that I've recently written, I showed that even Indians are investing more abroad. In the last 3-4 years, the money FDI is going more out of India. Indians are investing more foreign direct investments in the rest of the world. And there's a reason why they want to leave, and they also want to invest in other countries, because they don't see as much prospect within India. So not getting this piece sorted will at length have a problem for Indian policymakers also. And the people are in any case suffering very directly. They don't need an economic collapse affect their lungs. They are inhaling this thing anyway. As Gita Gopinath said, 1.7 million people are dying every year because of pollution. That's 17 lakh people. That's 18% of, or roughly 20% of all deaths. 1 in 5 is dying because of this. And that is at a time when we all know that, we don't have any dearth of issues on which people are dying. Diabetes, hypertension, cardiac problems, they're like endemic. Every family has those problems, and those numbers are fairly huge if you look at it at a global level. So, yeah, it's a bleak picture if we do not want to set this right.
And in the end, we talk about the ongoing probe into the Reliance Anil Ambani group. The Enforcement Directorate yesterday said it has attached fresh assets worth more than 1,800 crore rupees in an ongoing money laundering investigation involving companies linked to Reliance Group chairman Anil Ambani. With this action, the ED said the total value of assets attached in the case is now about 12,000 crore rupees. The ED said it issued 4 provisional attachment orders under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. The fresh attachment includes Reliance Infrastructure's shareholding in BSES Yamuna Power, BSES Rajdhani Power, and Mumbai Metro One Private Limited. According to the agency, the attached properties include bank deposits, shareholding in unquoted investments, and some immovable properties. The ED said these attachments relate to multiple matters, including cases linked to Reliance Home Finance Limited, Reliance Commercial Finance Limited, the Yes Bank fraud, and an alleged fraud involving Reliance Communications Limited. The agency said it has attached bank deposits of about 140 crore rupees and receivables worth around the same that it said were in the hands of Value Corp Finance and Securities Limited. It also attached a residential house in the name of a senior company executive, Angarai Sethuraman, and shares and mutual funds belonging to another senior employee, Puneet Garg. The ED said the total value of under the latest attachment is 1,885 crore rupees. In its statement, the ED also said it is investigating RCom, Anil Ambani, and others after taking cognizance of a CBI FIR and claimed that RCom and group companies have total outstanding loans of over 40,000 crore rupees, with 9 banks declaring the loan accounts as fraud. You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.